Late August has always been a time of lingering summer heat and the promise of fall, and for Jake and his wife, it was the perfect season to celebrate their engagement. They chose Fredericksburg, Texas, a charming town known for its wine tasting spots, rustic beer halls, and quaint little shops filled with trinkets. It was their kind of fun, easy, carefree, and a little whimsical. For their stay, they rented a cabin tucked away in what the locals called the Wash. It was a patch of dry, rugged land surrounded by rolling brown hills, dotted with sparse trees and scattered cacti. It had a distinctly Western feel, barren, remote, and serene. Do not burn signs were posted everywhere, even next to the fire pit outside the cabin, a detail they found more ironic than alarming. The days were spent exploring downtown Fredericksburg, indulging in wine and laughter, but it was the nights that felt different. The cabin was a good distance from town, and getting back required navigating narrow dirt roads that cut through open pastures. These were no ordinary roads. They were shared by cattle who roamed freely, their dark shapes barely visible against the night. It was an unspoken rule: the cows owned the roads, and the drivers were merely guests. That night, around 10 p.m., Jake and his wife began their slow trek back to the cabin. The pitch-black landscape stretched endlessly around them, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath the Jeep's tires. They had the convertible top down, a decision they now question as the cold night air pressed down on them tightly, exposing them to the vast emptiness. They joked to ease their discomfort, laughing about the cows and how it felt like they were invading some bovine kingdom. But even laughter couldn't shake the growing sense of vulnerability. The darkness wasn't just vast, it was oppressive, swallowing everything beyond the Jeep's headlights. Then they saw it. At first, it was just a shadow on the left side of the road, a black figure, low to the ground. Jake instinctively slowed the Jeep, unsure of what he was seeing. It moved on all fours, its body strangely compact, with abnormally long legs and a disproportionately large head. The creature's dark form seemed to blend into the night, but as they got closer, Jake could make out an eerie mix of black and gray in its skin and fur, if that's what it was. He thought it might be a coyote or a wolf, and his main concern was avoiding a collision. But as they got closer, something about the way it moved felt off. Its gait was awkward, almost unsettling, as if it were imitating the way an animal would walk. The creature stepped into the center of the dirt road, forcing Jake to slow even further. It was now only a few feet away, illuminated by the Jeep's high beams. That's when it turned to face them, and it stood up. Jake's heart dropped as the thing rose on what he thought were its hind legs, but they weren't legs, not in the way he understood them. They were human, bending unnaturally as it shifted its weight. The short, squat body he'd seen earlier stretched upward, revealing a torso that looked disturbingly human. It turned its massive head toward the Jeep, and for a moment, its glowing yellow eyes locked with Jake's. The light from the glowing eyes reflected off of them, giving them an almost unearthly intensity. Jake was frozen, caught between disbelief and raw, primal fear. The face of the thing, whatever it was, fitted the description, as if it had been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. Then, as abruptly as it had risen, the creature turned. It landed on all fours with an awkward jerk and slunk off into the darkness, heading in the opposite direction. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jake and his wife sat in stunned silence, the Jeep idling in the middle of the dirt road. It seemed like hours before his wife finally broke the silence, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Did you?" Jake cut her off, his voice low and strained. He just said, "Yes." He didn't need her to finish. He had seen it too, and it was real. Jake floored the accelerator, eager to put as much distance between them and the thing as possible. Neither of them spoke again until they reached the cabin, but the memory of those glowing eyes lingered like a ghost in the darkness. Back at the cabin, the couple didn't go inside right away. The air outside was thick with tension, as if the night itself had thickened after their encounter. Jake turned off the engine, and the silence distorted his form. Perhaps exhaustion and isolation were playing tricks on their minds, but deep down, he knew those weren't the answers. That thing didn't move like an animal, and those glowing yellow eyes, they weren't normal. The cabin's porch light flickered dimly as they approached, casting jagged shadows on the dry, cracked ground. The once enchanting isolation of their rented retreat now seemed ominous, the hills looming like silent sentinels in the distance. Inside, the cabin's familiar cooking did little to soothe his nerves. The rustic decor, wood beams, a stone fireplace, and a collection of vintage knickknacks felt almost oppressive now, the warm tones clashing with the chill that had settled into his bones. Jake locked the door and double-checked the windows, his every move quick and deliberate. His wife sat on the edge of the couch, her eyes darting toward the curtains covering the large front window. She asked him if he thought he'd followed them, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he peered through a small crack in the curtains, scanning the moonlit landscape for any sign of movement. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that pricked at the edges of his senses, making him feel exposed. He finally admitted that he didn't know, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was all in their heads, but he couldn't lie. The night dragged on, each hour feeling longer than the last. Neither of them could sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows set his nerves on edge. Jake found himself hearing sounds he couldn't name, his mind replaying the moment those yellow eyes locked onto his. At one point, his wife asked him what he thought it was. Jake hesitated, his hand tightening on the coffee mug he'd been holding for hours. He said again that he didn't know. But he said it wasn't normal, it wasn't natural. She nodded, her expression somber. Whatever they'd seen, it wasn't the kind of thing you could explain. By dawn, the oppressive weight of the night had lifted, but the memory of what they'd seen remained vivid. They'd packed up early, cutting their trip short. Jake hadn't even bothered to explain to the rental owner why they were leaving. As they drove away from the wash, the sun rising behind them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing standing in the middle of the road, its yellow eyes glowing in the morning light. But the road remained empty. Even now, months later, the memory lingers. Jake and his wife rarely talk about it, but when they do, it's always the same. A brief acknowledgement of that night, a silent nod to the unexplainable. Because some things, Jake realized, weren't meant to be understood. The nights of a couple were typical and uneventful, spent winding down with the usual routine. That particular night was no different. He'd had a few beers, lost himself in video games for a while, and eventually decided it was time to head to bed. The house was quiet except for the occasional noises from their 3 cats, especially the troublemaker of the trio. That one had a habit of meowing loudly in the middle of the night, always looking for attention. It was just part of the rhythm of their home. When morning came, he woke to find his wife clinging to him, her wide eyes betraying a rare look of fear. She wasn't the type to get rattled easily, so seeing her like this immediately set him on edge. He asked what was wrong, and that's when she told him what had happened. At around 2:50 a.m., she had been startled awake by a loud noise from downstairs. At first, it sounded like one of their cats, the rebellious one, meowing louder than usual. She sat there in the dark, trying to fully wake up and listen. But as she tuned in, her confusion quickly turned to fear. The sound wasn't quite right. The meows began to shift, taking on an unnatural tone. They sounded more like a person attempting to imitate a cat, their voice strained and distorted. And then it spoke. "Hello." The word was stretched out, almost mocking, and it repeated several times. She lay frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Whoever or whatever was making that noise stayed there for minutes, mimicking, speaking, taunting. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud bang on their bedroom door. It jolted her into complete silence, her breathing shallow as she tried to stay as still as possible. And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed with a motion sensor alert. She glanced at the screen and saw the notification, motion detected at the front door. The time read 2:52 and Maishi didn't wake him. She told him she was too terrified to move, too afraid that whatever was outside the door might hear her. Hearing her recount this in the bright light of morning didn't make it any less unsettling. He reached for his own phone to check the logs, and sure enough, the notification was there. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The more he thought about it, the stranger it became. He distinctly remembered setting the home security alarm at 9 p.m. the night before. It hadn't been turned off until they walked the dog that morning. None of the doors or windows had been opened, and all 3 cats had been locked in the bedroom with them. Whatever had been outside their door wasn't one of their pets. That day, as they ran errands, the events of the night before lingered in his mind. His wife wasn't prone to fear or flights of imagination, and hearing her describe the unnatural meows and the voice saying, "Hello," unnerved him in a way he couldn't shake. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone outside the house or a glitch in the security system. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the way her voice shook when she talked about it. When they got home, something else caught his attention. He had gone to hang up a shirt in the master bedroom closet when he noticed the attic access panel. The wooden board that normally sat flush against the ceiling had been shifted slightly, leaving a narrow gap. It wasn't something he'd ever paid much attention to before, but now it sent a chill down his spine. He called his wife over to ask if she'd been up there, but she shook her head. She said the builders would have secured it before they moved in. They were the first owners of the house, and no one else had ever lived there. The attic was untouched, or so they thought. The house had always felt a little off, they both admitted. Even in the daylight, there were moments when the atmosphere seemed strange, heavy. He had noticed it before, but brushed it off as his imagination. Now he wasn't so sure. He couldn't stop thinking about the voice his wife heard. The idea that someone or something had been in or around their home, mimicking sounds and speaking, sent chills through him. Was it a person playing a cruel joke? Or was it something worse? Whatever it was, it had shaken them both. And as the days went on, he couldn't ignore the subtle creeping feeling that the events of that night weren't a one-off. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like something was waiting, watching, just out of sight.